Like with the other keynote, we start and people might come still in. This year we try the first time to connect with equipment, because we have in mind to connect Europe with America and Japan in future. Yeah, it could be also an image that some people are in place, but there might be groups that cannot travel, and so we can connect communities which normally could not attend because they might attend a local workshop in the other continent, and they get connected. One idea is also, which will be our proposal to the JASPI community, that when they do a workshop for their community, it could be the workshop community also connected to our conference by some way of video connection. Yeah? I have the pleasure to try it out the first time, and we have two people who make this happen. One is Tats Daughtry, and Tats Daughtry is the person that helps us with the Software Quality Professional magazine from the American Society of Quality. And I will first ask him to say a few words about the EuroSPI connection with the ASQ and the SQP journal. And then, that will be only a few words, we will switch over to Arthur Hicken. And I have to say, I asked Tats to select an American expert who can give us a kind of idea of the future, because in this conference you have seen that we are changing the world, we get connected, yeah? We are Internet of Things, we have also IT security issues that are coming up. And Arthur Hicken, if you had time to read the internet, he's called an evangelist. And an evangelist in the American terminology doesn't mean that he is a certain religion, yeah? But an evangelist is a person that creates a vision for an organization. And in America, only few people are called evangelists, and he's from California and an evangelist, right? So, very nice environment, yeah? You want to make holidays there are big companies, and he's an evangelist at the right place. Yeah? So Arthur is from this company which is written there, Parasoft, and he has done big projects, consulting and training in big projects for Motorola, Cisco. He also is teaching, or was teaching at the University of Illinois. And he is also published in very prominent media in the United States. And therefore I asked him as a keynote to participate online to give his thoughts to our community. But first I would ask Tats Daughtry to tell us a few words about the very good relationship which we have on our collaboration on the ASQ/SQP magazine. Okay, Tats, can you say a few first words on this topic, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Richard, and I've really enjoyed the opportunity conference over the years. I've actually been present at several of the events, gave a keynote in Vienna, a very pleasant event several years ago. For the last number of years, the American Society for Quality Software Division has been in collaboration with this activity, with this conference, and one of the things that the division does is when they have a conference, we invite one of the speakers from this event that's designated as your best speaker to come over to our conference, complimentary, and to share with what we're doing in North America. And equivalently, we'd like to be able to let some of our best speakers come and share with you. I'm hoping that all of you have had the opportunity, as we've done several years now, to distribute the journal, Software Quality Professional. So you should have had copies, and we'll see in this month's issue, it's basically the key contributors from last year's conference. We've done this for the last couple of years, and we're looking forward to Richard and the program people identifying several other key contributors at this conference who will be invited to submit, and we'll have a special issue next year in the journal. So we look forward to this and other collaborations. We've had several other opportunities to make proposals for joint activities that we might be able to engage in research and development. So we're always appreciative of that, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to continue to contribute and collaborate with you, to learn from you. I've always enjoyed the special issues that we put together, and it's my pleasure also to be able to arrange for Arthur to come and speak. So I'll let him move on with the keynote, and once again, thank you, and look forward to meeting you virtually or in person whenever possible. Continue to collaborate. If you have any other interest in the journal, apart from this particular conference, if you have other papers or other topics of interest that you'd like to contribute, please be in touch with me as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I have the pleasure to hand over to Arthur Hicken and to give us his thoughts about the future development in this IT sector, and also his thoughts about maybe his vision he has created for Parasoft. Give us a vision also here in Europe and his thoughts. Thank you. So please start, Arthur. Arthur?
Thank you. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here to talk to you today. As they mentioned, I'm the evangelist at Parasoft, and that means that the religion that I'm selling is really high-quality software that's safe, secure, and reliable. There's a couple of links here if you want to follow my blog or follow me on Twitter. Those will be again at the end of the slideshow, so don't panic. There's one amusing one that you might want to follow there in the middle. It's the bit.ly/IoT shame. It's my Internet of Things Hall of Shame. Unfortunately, it's way bigger than it should be, but let's talk a little today. We're going to talk about how the fact that software is everywhere, and that software actually can hurt you. I have a customer that's a pharmaceutical customer, and they have a website, and if the website gets, someone could possibly die. So software has an impact on the real world that sometimes we discount. And one of my main themes as an evangelist is that software really should be engineering. And we frequently call software developers software engineers, but that's not necessarily the proper term for how they're working today. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the cost of good software versus bad software, and how we can make sure that the costs go down, the quality goes up, and more like engineering by using things like standards. So I'm sure you're aware things are everywhere. I've had discussions with some of the analysts, and they said, well, the Internet of Things is coming in maybe 5 years. Well, it's here. It's already here now. I separate it into the consumer Internet of Things, where we have thermostats and cars and smart homes and Fitbits and things like that, and the industrial Internet of Things, where there's actually already a whole lot of software and sensors running things day to day, from power plants, water treatment, street lights, etc. You can see some examples of things that are on the market today. We have connected cars more and more, again, thermostats, physical sensors, light switches. This little Belkin, I love it. It's not the most secure device in the world, but it's really a fun thing if you haven't played with it. So, you know, some people like to say that software is eating the world. I think that's not really the right analogy. I think that maybe software is infecting the world. And by this, I mean that it's slowly creeping into everything, into things that we never thought of as needing logic. And because of that, we have to think hard about the software we're putting in these and the ramifications of it. There's a case where, for example, a light bulb from Philips could be penetrated, and you think, well, what's the risk there? They turn my light off, it doesn't really matter. But it turns out that the software in the light bulb gives access to the router and thereby to the whole network. So what you're seeing here is pictures of things that have software in them. I used to have this little game I would play and ask people, which of these things have been hacked? I'll give you the answer right now, all of them. Everything you see on the screen, there's a software hack for this device. And if you go to the Hall of Shame, you'll see a whole lot more. It's at least once a week, sometimes once a day. So one of the things we have to remember about, like with this light bulb, is that in architectures like cars, for example, where the systems are interconnected, when we take over one component, there's a risk that we can take over other components. So I think this Death Star analogy is actually very apt, where the one little access point that you think, oh, well, that tire pressure sensor, it's not dangerous. All they can do is change the system readout for the tire pressure. Well, it turns out in some cars, with that, I can start the engine. So we have to think about a weak point in our software, whether it's a weak point from a system failure perspective or from a cybersecurity perspective. Now, we know that bad software has an impact to the company instantly in terms of how the users experience it. But it turns out it also has an impact on the share price of the company. And typically that impact may be many times larger than the physical cost of simply dealing with the faulty software. If we look at some of the things that have happened in the last year or two, we see that when companies had a headline software failure that actually made it to the news, they lost an average of about 4% of their shareholder value, so about $2.5 billion, which is usually enough money to make people pay attention. And the really interesting thing that we tracked some of these companies that had failures over the years, and we see that every time you have a failure, it gets more costly. And we see that these failures related to software are still becoming more frequent, and that their impact is larger. So it's quite a big problem. One of the really interesting things that I try to explain to people is that building good software is a little different than building something like a car. If I'm trying to build a very high quality car, I have to spend more on materials and more time to build it. It turns out that in software, you actually don't spend more to build high quality software. You spend more to build poor quality software. And so it's very interesting because we have to understand that in software, the bugs come from the programmer, right? They're put in. And so if we can stop introducing bugs, then we can actually have much better software at a much less expensive price. This quote here is from a talk back in, I think, 1973 called The Humble Programmer. I encourage you to look that up and read it. It's still very relevant today. This is a survey that Capers-Jones does every year. The numbers don't change very much. Basically, if you see the solid line, it shows me the typical cost of software from requirements through coding through maintenance. And you'll see that it's going up and up and up. And then there's a dotted line for healthy software development, and you see that the cost goes up until the point that you really start testing, and then it barely goes up. So you'll see that Capers has labeled this other line as pathological, meaning that this is bad health, right? This is software that's costing you a lot more. This is what I'm talking about. When I say that it's cheaper to build it, if I only count up until the moment of release, well, the cost is the cost. But if I think about the fact that I've got to test it and fix it and keep it alive in the field for a year or two or even 10 or 20, then I can see that this cost is really great. We also can look at the cost of when we find bugs and what it takes to deal with them. So, if we look at when we're coding and we find a bug right as I'm writing the code, the cost is relatively inexpensive. Here, like $25. It's very, very cheap. And I can find about 85% of the bugs in the space, so I can really reduce, the cost there. If I look out at post-release, it's about $16,000. And this is based on research into real companies doing real software, not a theoretical model. So it really behooves us to make sure that we're finding bugs early on and fixing them early on. When we take techniques like test time to find defects, like penetration testing, we put them in a much more expensive cycle. Again, it's probably 15 times as expensive as finding things early on. One of the shifts, and one of the reasons I say software isn't engineering, is that somehow over the years, software has developed the idea that it's QA's job to find bugs. Another way to say that is that you can test quality into your software. Now that's ridiculous, right? There's an old phrase in manufacturing that says that you can't test quality into a product. But for some reason, we think we can test quality into software. And you see here that the costs of attempting that methodology are quite high. And it's especially true in cybersecurity, where people may recognize that I can't test quality into a product, but they're trying to test security into a product by introducing security testing late in the cycle, rather than building secure software. So the reasons that I say software development is almost never engineering are these 4 basic steps. One is what they're doing isn't repeatable, meaning if I give it to different people, it won't happen the same. Different times, different releases may happen differently. It's hard for me to really understand before I release what's my risk. Is this actually going to work? Is it going to be safe? Is it going to be secure? Is it going to harm somebody? Is it going to do its job? Another is a lack of well-exercised best practices. If I hire an electrical engineer, I know what they're going to do, and I understand that they're going to choose the right kinds of wire with the right kinds of insulation to carry the right voltage, the right amperage, because they understand how to do it. That they have built on the existing knowledge in the industry. The way that this knowledge is shared is typically through building standards that tell them that at this wattage, this amperage, this voltage, you have to use this gauge of wire to carry that much electricity safely, otherwise you get a fire. In software, we tend to look at coding standards as a word that has no meaning. It's merely a rule that someone tells me I should follow, rather than an understanding that a coding standard is the embodiment of the knowledge of programmers that went before me. And the last item is that developer training is kind of unknown and inconsistent. When I hire a developer, I don't know where they've been taught and what they've been taught. I don't know if they're familiar with debuggers, if they're familiar with threaded issues, if they're familiar with performance issues, if they're familiar with how strings can affect memory usage in Java. Should I be using fixed strings? Should I be doing string concatenation? Should I be using string buffers? These are all actually very simple questions, and different people answer them differently, and they have great impact in software that runs over time. In engineering, when I hire an engineer, I at least understand the basic set of skills they have. So this is why I want to make software into engineering. When I look at this idea of building standards or coding standards, I look at what is the reason why we have these coding standards. And I've taken these quotes out of 2 different sources. One is the MSRA coding standards, which are really for the motor industry typically, and the Joint Strike Fighter, which is aircraft, which is kind of a child, a grandchild of MSRA. But you see, the goal is to produce proven programming practices that lead to safe, reliable, testable, maintainable code. Again, that sounds like something an engineer would do. Avoiding potentially unsafe things. And by providing safe alternatives to unsafe facilities, known problems are avoided. And again, we've kind of lost our way with coding standards. The tools in the last decade or so have shifted from detecting potentially problematic code that's unsafe or weak or not thread safe or potential security problems into looking for bugs. And while looking for bugs is a useful activity, building sound software is actually a more productive activity. What we want to do, like with building standards, is avoid the situation where a building is tipping over and going to collapse, or our software is going to collapse. In the case of cybersecurity, that our system can be penetrated. There's a bunch of different standards. I like to call these the standards, and some of these are based on industries, but I think they're all kind of informative. MSRA is typically for motor industry, but it can be used for other things. We'll talk about that. ISO 26262, which is functional safety, typically in electronic devices in transportation. DO 178BC is for aircraft and typically for Department of Defense, but you know, if it'll keep a fighter jet in the air, it should also keep a regular jet in the air. SANS CERT, which is cybersecurity standards. They're very thorough, very broad. OWASP Top 10 is typically only web application, but it's great because it's prioritized around the 10 things that are most likely to happen to you. And they change those every year to keep track with emerging threats. Joint Strike Fighter, as I mentioned, is kind of a child of MISRA. So again, it's around aircraft, but can be very useful for embedded devices because it's about reliability and safety and security. DSISTIG, if you're dealing with defense industry, becomes very important. And CWE is a bunch of research that was funded by the US government, but free for use by everybody. And it lists out about 800 different things that can go wrong with software. And it's really interesting because it lists the impact. So instead of saying, well, you shouldn't have a buffer overflow, it says something like, well, this buffer overflow can lead to a denial of service. This buffer overflow can lead to a loss of data. So it's very interesting in that it takes into account what they call a technical impact. So it's a standard worth looking at. And again, it's completely free, so that's kind of great. One of the other interesting things is that we often think of security as being orthogonal to software development. And it turns out SEI Research Institute has found that you can actually predict software assurance, in other words, security, using quality and reliability measures. Turns out about 80% of cybersecurity issues are actually the same thing as quality issues. Again, I take a classic example like the Heartbleed exploit of 2 years ago, where the OpenSSL certificates for securing web transactions were able to be spied on. And it turns out the underlying root cause to that was a buffer overflow or an unchecked parameter, depending on your perspective. And that's a classic software problem. But it turns out that cybersecurity intrusions generally depend on weak software. So you can predict security based on defects, but if you use static code analysis, you can actually improve things. I want to talk about software security as opposed to cyber security because it's a narrower vision. But the idea that we're creating the software so that it works right when it's under attack. It is one thing to say we want to block all attacks, and that involves hardware and networking, etc. But at the application level, I want to make sure that when things go wrong that I behave properly so that really worse things don't happen. The other thing that people have pointed out when they've understood this, like Gary McGraw over at Digital, is that it's a lot easier to protect something that's defect-free than something that's full of vulnerabilities. So again, if we're trying to secure our software, the best place to start is to make the software better inherently. And if we think of software security as an additional expense, it turns out that's not actually true. That the things that we're doing to secure our software, 80% of the time, are also just making it better. So let me talk a little. I said MISRA isn't just for cars, and again, while it has motor industry in the title, the thing I like about MISRA as a coding standard is that it's really well defined, right? As you look at each standard, it tells you exactly what it is, what's going on, why it matters. It's updated. Every couple of years they go through it, they make changes as languages evolve, they evolve the standards around it. As the technologies that can detect things, they evolve, so that the recent versions of MISRA take into account what things are decidable and what aren't, which is a fancy way of saying that the static analysis is actually able to detect this with no false positives and no false negatives. And it's a very flexible standard that can take into account different severity levels and things like that. Another issue that makes it really good in the compliance industry, like medical, for example, is that there's a good strategy for deviation. Again, meaning that if I find a static analysis rule violation or a standard violation, should I safely suppress it or must I fix it? And that's laid out in the standard. Again, it's very auditable, so that's great because if someone's coming in on a medical device, you can say, well, here's what I did, here's exactly how I did it, here's why I did it. It's very easy to prove and tell a good story about why you're using this standard and why you're using the rules you are. At the end, I say, why not? This is if you're trying to pick a coding standard, for example, for embedded, for IoT, for automotive, for medical, where else are you going to start? I think it's a really great starting place because it's very comprehensive. There are a couple of interesting other standards that I've listed here. IEC 62304 in particular for electrical devices can be an important standard. There's a couple you may not have thought of. The book Effective C++, now in its 3rd edition, or maybe even 4th edition, there's a Effective C++ 11 out now, talks a lot about not so much in finding bugs, but in ways that your software can look fine and be fine, but have a potential problem hiding inside of it. So it's a really fascinating read. What we've found is that the inadequate defect removal is the main cause of poor quality software, right? Programmers are about 35% efficient in finding bugs in their own software, and that leaves us way too low. If we look down here, we can see that some other things, if we sum up everything, typically all the steps that we do to remove bugs, design review, peer review, unit test, functional test, etc., take out about 75% of the bugs. And this is done by measuring how many bugs we found before we shipped and how many bugs end up in the first 90 days reported in the field. It turns out static analysis, when used properly and used in a preventative mode, can take out about 85% of the bugs in an application. So you can see this is a real improvement for us, not only on poorly configured static analysis, but against the entire system. I'm still finding a lot more bugs. I wanted to show just some of the kinds of defects that you could find using that exist in applications, but also can be found. So it might be database problems, input validation, race conditions, memory leaks, errors in algorithms, etc. It turns out that there are coding standards, and that's why I listed SANS and MITRE here, that talk about these particular problems, and there are coding standards for these particular things. So if you're worried, for example, about race conditions, there are static analysis coding standards out there that will mitigate this problem for you. The big issue is whether we want to fix. I have a fun little picture here. We're all familiar with the Tower of Pisa, and we understand that the initial design requirements were not for a tilting tower. That this is a problem that was, discovered later and long-term became a really big problem. There's a thing they're doing now to try to stabilize it, which is kind of working, but we know that the cost of straightening the tower is extremely expensive and extremely risky. Well, what a lot of people don't know is that we have a similar problem in America, or we had a similar problem. We built this funny obelisk here, and I say funny because it's kind of Egyptian for American architecture. But when they built this obelisk, this is the Washington Monument, and it was originally designed to be right in the middle of the government layout in Washington, D.C. So it was centered between the White House, the Congress Capitol building, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Jefferson Memorial. And this was exactly in the middle. If you look at a map, and you can go into Google Earth and you can see that it's actually not in the middle. And what happened was when they started to dig the foundation, knowing the story of Pisa, they found out that it was not stable enough. This was a classic example of not fixing it like they're trying to do with Pisa. Instead, they said, we can either deal with a wobbly tower here and ultimately maybe fall, or we can move the tower, and that's the preventative measure. Before we started building, they moved it about 200 feet so that it's on a stable environment. And that's why I talk about fixing versus preventing, because a lot of vendors sell tools that are really early detection, and that's great. It's a really great strategy, but it's not prevention. It's just early detection. I wanted to give some examples of preventative standards, and again, we can make these slides available to you later. But the reason I put this list here, you can read through it on your own, is that all of these are things that if you just told a developer to follow them, they would think it was stupid. They would claim it was a false positive or unimportant and not going to fix it. But if you go and read up on all these issues, you can find out that they all lead to very, very serious problems. So it's a pretty interesting thing that I picked these ones. And if you have questions, feel free to contact me. I can point out why these things are important. If you're not really deeply familiar with static analysis, these things should sound silly to you. And so it's intended to kind of shock you and encourage you to look more into it. I want to define static analysis just for a moment because it can mean a lot of different things to different people. But the idea, the base piece meaning that I'm analyzing the program without actually running it. And the advantage of this is that I don't need a big, expensive system running, and I can only run a part of the application. In theory, I can run as soon as the system starts being built. So it's really comprehensive, and it's really unbiased, and it's really, really early. So that's a really great thing about it. The types of things that produce results that I would include in static analysis are, for example, compiler warnings. We don't pay enough attention to compiler warnings. And again, they're not bugs, but the compiler vendors have a pretty good reason for telling you that something isn't as good as it should be. This is like building a house and looking at the board that you put up and realizing that maybe there's a bad knot in it, that the board is too warped, and setting it aside rather than using it. You might use it, you might get away with it, but if you're really worried about what you're building, you should pay attention. Again, there's coding standards and policies. We have a more modern technology that's been around for about 15 years now. It's flow analysis that really is good at detecting bugs, but isn't so good at error prevention. And I view metrics as a form of static analysis as well. For example, looking at behavior complexity, cyclomatic complexity, and things like that. So the traditional static analysis from the late 60s, early 70s is what we call pattern-based static analysis. And again, it's really great at identifying patterns in the code, like here's the kind of code that is leading to a performance problem, here's the kind of code that doesn't have validated input. It's great for making sure that things are included, like validation handlers on data, or security methods are called, or proper encryption methods are called. It's great at branding issues, making sure that you're including proper copyright, proper password encoding technologies, great at preventing problems, and great at improving developers, because if you run it while you're coding, what happens is it's like someone tapping you on the shoulder and saying, hey, did you think about doing that the right way? Did you think about doing that this other way? And as it taps you on the shoulder and you fix the code over and over, eventually you just write code that way. It's really quick. Each source file is analyzed separately, so it can't look at the application as a whole typically. It looks more at a file, but it can find things like logical errors, API misuse, typographical problems, security problems. It turns out it's really, really good at thread problems, where flow analysis can find a few. It turns out most thread problems are actually related to library misuse. And so it's really easy to enforce proper library use with static analysis, and not so much to find thread problems, but to find code that's susceptible to thread problems. Now the flow analysis, as I was talking, is a newer technology, and it really simulates execution. It's not real execution. It's really like when you look at code and you say, well, if I put in 2 here and I put in 3 there, 6 will come out over there. And the software does this for you, trying to say, well, is 6 really coming out, or did I get 7 when I thought I was going to get 6? So it's nice because it finds real bugs, and it makes you really feel good. It's really, hypothetical execution paths, which is why we sometimes get false positives, because the path might not be possible, or it might not be very normal. But it can find possible errors and things like exception problems, optimization problems. It's great for finding leaks. And again, for security problems like tainted data. So the thing that you can do with static analysis as a fundamental game changer is identify defective code. You can flag defect-prone code. And this is one of the huge game changers that people often overlook. Instead of saying, I want to find every instance of tainted data, the question I ask is, how can I write code in such a way that data cannot be tainted? And we'll show an example of that in a moment. We can enable policy enforcement. We can flag unmaintainable code. And again, if the code's going to be around for a long time, it's great to make sure that the code can easily be understood by other developers. Now, another thing to think about is that static analysis really can do prevention. So I want to talk about an example here and maybe talk about the fact that we can do preventive static analysis, meaning here's a piece of code that's susceptible to a problem. Here's flow analysis, meaning, oh, I found a specific instance of a problem in your code. And runtime error detection, which means I was monitoring your application while it was running, and I actually found, for example, a memory leak. So we take something like uninitialized memory. Runtime error detection will find it if your test suite is thorough. Runtime error detection is very, very accurate, but it only checks the lines of code that you execute, so it's only as good as your coverage. Flow analysis may or may not find an uninitialized memory problem, depending on the complexity of the application. We know that the number of variants in a real-world application typically exceeds the number of molecules in the universe, meaning we can't really test them all. So we may or may not find uninitialized memory. Now, it turns out that if we decide as a policy that we're going to initialize all variables when we declare them, uninitialized memory can never, ever happen. So if we look at standards like Messnarz, their goal isn't so much to detect uninitialized memory, but to write code so that you don't have to detect it. And that's why I say this is much more of an engineering principle. The example when we build bridges would be that in the software world, we would build a bridge and we would drive bigger and bigger trucks over it until it collapsed. And we would weigh the last successful truck, and we'd say, okay, that big, and we'd build it again, and we'd deploy a new bridge. Well, in the real world, that's really expensive, and it's really kind of foolish. So in the software world, we need to behave more like the real world and understand that these engineering principles will allow us to carry this size truck over a bridge without actually destroying the bridge in the process. So when I'm doing static analysis, how do I know which rules to run? I mentioned that CWE has about 800 different issues. And the way that I typically tell people to do it, sometimes you have a compliance requirement. If you're doing 26262, or if you're doing Messnarz, if you're doing cybersecurity, you may have a very specific list you have to do. But if you're just trying to be more safe, more reliable, more secure, I would base it on why am I doing static analysis? Look at the issues I expect to happen. Look in particular at my bug tracking system. What happened to me in the last release and the release before that? And turn on rules that are directly correlated to the problem I'm having. Again, if it's buffer overflow, turn on all my buffer monitoring rules. Don't just turn on rules because they sound nice academically. Turn on rules because I know they have an actual impact on the code that I'm writing. And avoid the idea that if one rule is good, 1,000 rules are better. Pick a few that, small enough number that you can actually fix them and follow them sustainably so that you don't have a big problem. Again, choose the rules carefully, implement them progressively. Start with a few rules, come into compliance with them, and then extend the date backward. By that I mean initially only check the code that's brand new, maybe the code that was written from today on. Once you come into compliance, then you do all the code from this month, and then you set it back to all the code from 6 months ago, and eventually the whole time. And again, there's this cycle that I have where we do peer review and regression testing, and we're finding problems, and we analyze those problems in a post-mortem and say, was there a methodology to prevent this problem from happening in the first place? Not just to detect it, but to actually prevent it from happening. And if so, how can I do it? Now, those who are familiar with things like Deming will understand that this is a very typical manufacturing process. It turns out in engineering, we can also do this in software. So I wanted to leave a few minutes for question and answers, but it's just a couple of quick sums. One is that standards and static analysis applied properly not only do early detection, but actually do prevention. In other words, instead of finding a bug early, by changing the way you write code so that you're avoiding the possibility of the error at all in the first place. When I look at heart bleed again, there's now detectors for the specific instance of heart bleed, but there's a way to write code that heart bleed could never ever happen, and that's a better methodology. And as Dijkstra said, having a solid prevention methodology, writing good software, not injecting bugs, is less than the cost of actually fixing these bugs. Or to put it another way, the cost of good software is actually less than the cost of bad software. And additionally, if you have hardware issues where you're putting things out in the world, and especially things like cars or routers that are going to last for several years, the cost of quality, safe, secure software is less than the cost of a single recall. So it's important to make sure that you fund your software construction properly. I put in here a couple of security resources. Again, I'll probably put this slide back up while we're doing the QA, but these are all free resources, so I kind of left them for you, right? MITRE.org, which is this common weakness enumeration around things that can go wrong. CERT for secure coding guidelines. Build security in. It's funded by the U.S. government, but that's okay. You can use it, right? I won't tell anybody. And it's a lot of really, really, really great information about how to build better software. You can tell what their methodology is by the name. It's not about detect security problems. It's about building security in. And of course, I work for Parasoft, so, quick plug, right? We do a bunch of stuff like this. Ways to reach me, my email here, codecurmudgeon@gmail.com. Some websites, you can follow me on Facebook, you can follow Parasoft on Facebook. I have a Google Plus community, if you use Google Plus, called Static Analysis for Fun and Profit. You can come and learn about static analysis and get involved in a conversation. So with that, Richard, it would be nice if we could do some question and answer.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, we have one question from Walter.
Hi, Arthur. Thanks for a great speak. 20 years ago in Chicago, I heard about a concept called clean room engineering. Have you seen that and what happened to it? Sounds like some of the same ideas behind it.
Yeah, it's funny because we keep going through loops trying to improve software development, and so we come across old ideas and we recycle them again. And people are trying to go different directions with different methodologies, trying to improve software. It turns out that individual methodologies, they matter a little, but overall it's consistent behavior that really matters more than whether we're doing team engineering, pair programming, agile, waterfall, etc. But the focus on quality, the focus on security has just as much, if not more, of an impact than the particular methodology. Again, if you look at this Dijkstra paper from '73, he's saying things like, that one of his quotes in particular says that he expects that the industry is about to recognize the cost of bad software is greater than the cost of good software. And of course, here we are, 40 years later, and we haven't yet recognized it. So it's kind of funny, kind of sad.
Okay, more questions? Okay, Thomas?
Why is everybody sitting in the back? You should all move down.
This is like in Europe, they are older than the young students, so they all hide in the back and don't sit in the front anymore, so I have to run for you.
Okay, one question. You had cost figures that started with code analysis. So the stages upfront coding means requirements or design are not included in this. So your cost figure assumes that the requirements and the design are cleared up and all errors in the requirements and in the design are corrected, isn't it so?
So if you look at this chart here, you can see that we're only including from coding on. But if you look at this chart and if you look at this report, you can see at the bottom here, You can get this, if you send me an email, or if you just Google this, you'll find this report, which talks more about it, but it's certainly actually, some of the books come in from the requirement phase, right? Some of them come from the design phase. About 80% come in from the coding phase. So I focus a lot on the coding phase, but yeah, it's absolutely true that we have to factor in the requirements of design, and that if we do things in a very measurable, consistent way, we can start to understand. For example, if we lock our requirements down, we can start to see scope creep. If we explicitly link our code to requirements, we can see scope creep. Because suddenly I have a piece of code that's not tied to a requirement. And in fact, there's another benefit here. If we pay more attention to a holistic view, like you're saying, where we think about requirements, if we have code explicitly tied to a requirement, and then I'm analyzing an application, and suddenly I have a piece of code not tied to a requirement, I know I have a pretty big problem. Because either I'm doing a poor job at requirements, or I have somebody writing code that shouldn't be in the application. And it's actually one of those ways that I use to try and detect backdoors and Easter eggs and security breaches, is looking for code that really doesn't belong in the application. And if I have a very mature process where we're strict about requirements and we lock them down and we clearly associate code with requirements, it's a lot easier to do a good job detecting backdoors, kind of like the problem that occurred last year with VW, right? Could I have detected this code that really didn't belong there, that there was no requirement in the field for doing this particular behavior?
Okay, one more question from Alexander.
So Alexander Move from Electric. Thank you for the talk, because there is a little divide between US and Europe. So you bring in the papers from Capers Jones, which are absolutely brilliant and are rarely read on this side of the ocean. So thank you for that. And the next thing is, what is, from your point of view, the worst MISRA rule in 2012?
The worst MISRA?
The worst one, yeah.
You know, it's funny because different ones produce false positives. The latest MISRA standard has a list of things that they say you can find this, but you can't find that. I actually don't agree with it. From our technology, we find some things that they say can't be found, so it gives me an idea of where their people are versus mine. But for me, the worst rule is the one that, it's not a particular rule, but it's a conceptual thing. It's the rule that I don't understand or don't have an explanation for why it's important or why I care. If as a manager I can't tell a developer this rule leads to this problem that we've had in the field or that we worry about in the field, then it's a bad rule. It's funny, I'm gonna repoint the camera here for a second. Actually, I think I unplugged it. I have on my wall a particular thing. Let me see if I can grab this real quick, because I see I tripped on my cable. There we go.
It's always a hardware problem, isn't it?
Yeah, darn cable. That's why we're supposed to be wireless. So I noticed that you can see part of my whiteboard there. So it's probably not really great, but you can see there's a big thing there. And this is where the problems in static analysis come in with MISRA. So at the top I have false positives, and there's 4 buckets here. There's 4 columns. One is that there's a bad result. This means that the tool actually didn't implement the rule properly. As it turns out, this is not a very common problem. The more common problems are that the end user, meaning the programmer, didn't understand the rule, or didn't understand, that's this one here, the value of the rule or the impact of the rule. So I took Heartbleed as an example. When we looked at the code for Heartbleed in OpenSSL, I took it to one of our most senior developers, and I showed him the line of code, and I showed him the static analysis rule, MISRA rule, and I said, would you fix it? And he says, no, that's a stupid rule. To answer your question, right? Is there a stupid rule? And I said, you realize that's Heartbleed? And he's like, what? Wait a minute. And he looked at the code, he's like, oh, that's not a stupid rule. But because he didn't understand the impact, why it mattered. So I think that MISRA is doing a better job than they did at explaining why a rule matters, but it's not good enough yet. I think that CWE is doing a great job at explaining why rules matter, and CWE is now trying to branch out from not just cybersecurity, but general quality issues. I know that internally here, where I work, we have an initiative to try and make sure that in the first line of output from the tool, we don't just say buffer overflow, that we say buffer overflow leading to loss of data, or things like that. And so I think that the problematic rules to me are the ones that don't explain why they matter.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, one more question. Okay. For medical science now.
I would like to know your opinion as an evangelist, that how do you see the future of rigorous methods and formal methods in this perspective? Because you haven't mentioned that so far in your talk.
Yeah, I focus a lot on the things that people do day to day here, right? I think people need to be more formal to be able to prove that the software works, right? And for people that are rigorous, they have less of a problem, so I've spent less time focusing on rigorous development processes. In America, if I look at like people doing secure systems in a bank, they might be far more formal than, say, an online website. In some cases, we have pure cowboy behavior, and starting to talk about formal methods to these people is a non-starter. I think they're so chaotic, they're so not engineering. I think that doing formal methods and thinking about the design of the application, laying it out so that I can prove it, leads you to a much better state. People aren't necessarily ready for it in some cases, right? It's part of the, how do I get an engineer who's used to not being an engineer, who's used to doing whatever he wants, who's used to taking a vague specification, is probably too strong of a word, a request, let's say, right? Not even a requirement, but someone says, hey, I need something to do X, Y, Z, and rather than sitting down and saying, here's all the things that it should do, so that the tester can now begin to make tests, and so that the design can follow it, they just build something that goes, does this do that? And they don't think about the ramifications. And that is, again, one of those key reasons why I say that, in America at least, we don't have a software engineering degree anywhere. There's no cooperative standards for software engineering. In electrical and manufacturing and machining, it's insane to think of that, right? But we don't know. So I think that, teaching people formal methods, teaching them behavior using requirements and design, teaching people that you can be agile and still plan things is probably the most important key, right? And I think that's where we're going to get, because agile shouldn't collide with quality software, but it frequently does, because people take agile to mean that, again, if you look at this graph where we have requirements and design, they make it into this graph where they just code, right? And that's a bad idea. So, yeah, I think that software will get more rigorous in certain fields. I expect that it will only become more rigorous in fields where either it's inherently dangerous and therefore there's a cost, or where the government or someone else steps in and forces it. And that may be what will happen, right? That various governments will start requiring better behavior of us. Scary.
Thank you.
Okay, is there one more question? Okay, so I might have a concluding question. My question is in this direction. When you look at Dijkstra, you mentioned Dijkstra a few times, and everyone of my age had to learn Dijkstra, yeah? And it was the basis to write compilers. Yeah? So it was all the rule sets on which basis all the compilers were developed in the 60s, 70s, and so forth. And what Dijkstra did is he always believed that there is a set of rules so that you come to the deterministic behavior of a program. So it means that you always have at the end a kind of machine that always has a certain state at the end which you can achieve. Now, what we are reaching at the moment in our world of automotive is that cars are in the cloud, and they move to the cloud. And so, like with a human being, you might get the same situation, but the car reacts differently because there was a learning factor counting in the background. Maybe some time parameter, some more cars in the environment which deliver the same value, and the car behaves differently even if you use the same variables. So my question to you is, what do you think about this future? Because maybe we have to extend Dijkstra nowadays time, yeah?
You know, it's certainly there's pluses and minuses to this cloud migration that we've done. On the minus side, things have gotten way more complex, right? I'm giving a talk in about 90 minutes on this issue, and it's you know, it's a very interesting thing because we're consuming lots of pieces of software that aren't our own, and that used to mean like buying a library, and I had the source, or I had the binaries, and I understood it, could test it. It was all in the scope of inside of my world, and now I'm consuming a third-party service. I don't know if it's available, what happens if it's not available, what happens if it's overloaded, what happens if it gets hacked, will I get hacked if it gets hacked? So we've certainly added a lot more access points, attack surfaces, if you will, as well. A lot of variability. On the other hand, what we've done is finally forced developers to think about component level design. We think in much smaller pieces. And if you think about trying to understand, you know, the software in a rocket, there's a ton of software. It's hard to get the whole picture. But if you think about the software around the injector on the thruster that's controlling the spark, igniting it, that's hard. Not hard to test, not hard to understand. And so the componentization that is being driven by the cloud is actually giving us pieces that are not only smaller and more well-defined, but because they're going to be used by people I've never met, my interfaces are now well-defined. And it turns out that there's a new technique that they call service virtualization that lets me simulate these pieces, and I can begin to not only test early, but because of the simulation, I can start to test things I wouldn't normally test. So what happens when I run out of memory? What happens when I can't write to the disk? What happens when someone trips over the cord and the camera disappears, right? These are all things that are hard to test in the real world, but because I have little components that talk through APIs, I can do more of a, I think of it like a Turing test, right? We think about normal server virtualization in that I'm simply removing the hardware component from an application. With service virtualization, I'm recognizing that a component is the sum of its communication. How it decides its communication is not relevant to my virtualization. If I send a piece of text to an application and that text happens to be SQL, it sends back a result set. Whether it has 17 databases behind it, 4 disks, I just don't care. All I care is that if I can talk to it and it talks like a database, that's why I call it a Turing test, then it's good enough for my purposes. So I think that we've brought new challenges, but new tools have come along and are really helping in that area as well.
I understand, yeah. But that would still mean that, that we have to add the component-based thinking to the old Dijkstra view. Because in Dijkstra it was the execution view of deterministic behavior. So we expect now that we have a set of components and each of them has some deterministic behavior because the programmers were good enough. Or, what you said, if I correctly understand, that if I expect some service on the internet, that we are good enough in programming that we consider every case. And then we are back at what you said, we need the code quality in our component, right?
Yeah, so there's one big difference here that we have to think about, and that is that if the component is simply being accessed like a credit card check, it's relatively easy to make sure that it's working right and to deal with it when it's not working right. It's a relatively limited number of test cases. If, on the other hand, it's a component with both a sensor and an actuator sitting inside of a car, then it's hard to predict all of the ways that these things will interact, right? So The single transaction model is relatively easy to model and to test out. And when we think about a web application like Amazon, there's no way of knowing every possible path I'm going, right? It's not even possible. I just have to ensure at least that each piece is working really, really well, that integration works well in basic models. And I have to say that while I know from the inside Amazon has problems, as a user, we never see them. We just don't see them. So that they are actually very good at handling gracefully the unexpected. And that's a different programming paradigm.
Yeah, but that would then extend the way how we had to interpret Dijkstra, because this is a kind of behavior model instead of a deterministic programming model.
Well, you know, code was small in Dijkstra's day. I mean, I'm working with a customer right now that one single application from their portfolio is 20 million lines of code. You know, when I started at Parasoft, our biggest customer was an aerospace one, and the biggest application we're scanning was maybe 200,000 lines. And that was huge, right? Enormous. Now that's, you know, that's trivial. It's a smart toothbrush.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. It was really fun.